Welcome back, everyone. The first presentation of the afternoon is by Dr. Sandy Greer, which is PMD 14-P1.18 and 18A. Dr. Greer, the floor is yours. You do have 30 minutes. The same rules as last time. The amber light comes on, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank the panel for giving me this opportunity to speak again and participate at this public hearing. The subject that I chose was the methodology of OPG and to provide a critique. After submitting both parts of my presentation, I was scheduled to speak today, and therefore took responsibility to read the risk assessment on all of the alternative means as well, even though my entire presentation is really based on 510, the EIS 510, in terms of the methodology provided by the OPG. So my presentation is going to address the absence of an ecological literacy approach to understanding the potential impacts of consequences from any releases of radionuclides into the environment at all levels. So I now will proceed, and what I will do, because I made a very intensive presentation with the intention of providing good information to the panel and to the wider public. And I therefore have made quite a long presentation just so it's on the public record. So I'm going to be speaking only to certain passages in each of my slides to try to fit everything into the half hour. Thank you. So first of all, I just want to introduce the concept of ecology, which is the study of the Earth household, in regard to the relationships between all members of the Earth household, including plants, animals, and microorganisms, and their natural environment, living and non-living. In Western culture, these areas are referred to as the abiotic environment, which includes air, minerals, water, and sunlight, and the biotic environment, which are plants and animals and insects and all of the living organisms that reside on the earth, in the air, water, and on the ground. And I want to point out that in looking at ecosystems, we need to deal not only with ecology, but that awareness must be grounded in other fields of knowledge, such as biology, geology, atmospheric chemistry, thermodynamics, and other branches of science. Now, ecological ethics is the system of principles which indicate to humans how they ought to comport themselves in their interaction with the non-human world. So here there are various ways that are really progressive in trying to go from a very linear to a more holistic understanding of how we exist on the earth and can conduct ourselves in respect of the planetary life support system that humans enjoy. And therefore, we can first of all look at the common English usage, which suggests the empirical mathematical examination of physical reality to be no more than observation and statistical systematization of observed phenomena. It prides itself on objectivity. It seeks to be rigorously value-free. However, then one can proceed to a deeper understanding of science and how we approach our reality on this earth through human ecology and ecological ethics, in which we have to look at the deeper and broader inquiry into the value system of life and of human dwelling in the community of all beings. These are no longer questions simply of the structure of life processes. Their purpose is not simply theoretical modeling, but a reliable guidance for our acting, how we ought to live it. and in relationship to, as Indigenous people would say, all our relations, that we are interrelated with everything alive on this planet, and we need to honor and respect and protect that. So then, in regard to ecosystem principles, the International Commission on Radiological Protection also has a perspective, and they refer to it as an ecosystem approach that is a more recent trend. Again, it is specifically for the protection of the environment. This requires that one looks at the environment or a specific and identified part of it as a whole and considers all of the factors that might adversely affect it. And therefore, I just wanted to point out too that in my reading of several publications by the ICRP, I just got the sense that they are making very credible steps towards an understanding of an ecosystem approach, but even their language sort of gives them the way that they're still, I think, more engaged with the empirical mathematical approach rather than a more holistic ecological approach in its fullest sense. But they are making great strides in the last decade or more in really identifying the fact that we need to consider radioactive implications and potential consequences on all living organisms, not just humans. Now, in regard to ecosystem principles, again, Dr. Peter Dunker last year was invited by the panel to be a presenter and to contribute his expertise. And one of the requests in the undertaking following his submission was to outline a holistic view of the ecosystem. So here again, he basically articulated what I quoted from another source. And I've quoted a few different sources to demonstrate that there's quite a wide awareness about ecosystem principles and ecology, even if it's not necessarily fully implemented at this historic moment. It's a journey that we're all on as human beings on this earth. So I also have two other quotes here by Dr. Dunker, and the point I would like to emphasize is that at the bottom here, he pointed out that what's critically important is the way an ecosystem analysis unfolds is always dependent on the objectives of the analyst. So he really stressed that last year. And therefore, when an ecosystem approach is used for a project, the proponent may not invest as much energy into addressing the ecological relationships than if somebody were doing some type of other study for other purposes than an industrial project. So my concern here, and I'm going to be showing later the example of the Lake Fringe watershed, is the ecosystem perspective in terms of watersheds, as an example, in relation to the specific DGR project. I would like to quote just the bottom paragraph that in Canada, the Auditor General's fourth review of SEA Strategic Environment Assessment practice in Canada reported the SEA directive has yet to be consistently applied across federal departments and agencies, and that SEA has not been undertaken for some proposals where significant environmental effects could result. And that was part of a number of papers I read on impact assessment. But I will, whoops, I went backwards here. What happened? Excuse me. Okay, moving forward. Okay. So in the different impact assessment perspectives, of course, Dunker and his working partner, Grieg, they were cited a number of times, but there are many other experts who have worked in the field and are working in impact assessment. And it's really a field, a work in progress that is continually evolving and developing and improving on the various assessment procedures and what gets evaluated. And so again, in the middle here, Greer and Dunker, they really emphasize the need to look at impact prediction, significance determination, and an approach based upon systems analysis. And this significance determination really is the core issue of my concern, because basically the OPG's methodology concluded that there were no adverse effects of significance, which was the rationalization they gave for not doing certain kinds of investigations to date on potential impacts of possibly leaking radionuclides. So that is, when I read that, that's why I just wanted to find where else there might be that awareness, both within the nuclear industry internationally and independently from it. So one of the issues is the huge uncertainties that are well known, as that's one of the reasons for the precautionary principle to be of such importance, because one of the reasons for that is a scientific uncertainty. So referring specifically to Canada, there is a whole history that I read about in a book called Deliberative Democracy for the Future, the Case of Nuclear Waste Management in Canada. And again, similar to Greer and Dunker and people in the impact assessment field, the author, Genevieve Fuji Johnson, she wrote about the whole history of how the partnerships and the responsibilities evolved in Canada in regard to the nuclear industry and in regard to the management of nuclear waste. So, so she also points out that what the Seaborne panel many years ago had recommended was actually not fully taken up by the federal government, who decided instead that the framework simultaneously gave the waste producers and owners the responsibility of establishing, organizing, managing, and funding radioactive waste facilities, and established a policy role for the government and an operations financial role for the nuclear energy industry. Rather than the nuclear industry having more of an arm's length relationship, which is what the Seaborne panel had recommended. Now, in regard to her book, it's very informative, and she also cites a researcher, Christian Schrader-Frechette, who points out that there are various types of uncertainties. And here, in regard to the modeling uncertainty, that's of key pertinence here because of the mathematical modeling that so extensively, I believe, has been used by the OPG and the CNSC in terms of arriving at some of their conclusions and suggestions. And the modeling uncertainty refers to questions of validating and verifying models of complex systems that function over the very long period. Given the time frames at play in numerous areas of science, technology, and environment, there is often no possible way of checking certain models against the reality they represent, or of verifying hypotheses based on these models. We cannot observe, for example, the behavior of a nuclear waste management system over its lifespan. So that's a pretty big area of uncertainties. The other important point that is made in the book, among many, but here I wanted to identify the quantitative risk assessment as among the commonly employed policy decision-making models since the 1980s, and its process is embedded in risk-cost-benefit analysis. And the basic presuppositions of QRA are that risk is defined as the probability of a harm multiplied by its magnitude. Probabilities are objective, determined empirically, and expressed quantitatively. Harms can be identified, quantified, measured, and weighed, and the acceptability of risks can be rationally calculated according to a maximizing standard. Meanwhile, there are ecosystem concerns, and the ICRP is aware of them, and I wanted to give credit to the ICRP that for a number of years, it is on a journey that continues in regard to recognition of protection of the environment. And in this image, I just wanted to point out to everyone that they created and identified particular types of species, which are shown in the image there in the center at the bottom. And what they've done is they are developing, and it is still in development, the reference animals and plants in parallel with like the criteria used for humans for reference man. And they show Leonardo da Vinci's image of a human being to show the parallel here, and that they are on this journey of investigation in terms of radiation doses, looking at exposure pathways, and dosimetric models. Now, I wasn't able to, I just ran out of time to read more of the literature, but at this time they're focusing on the biotic species, and they are not addressing pathways at this time. But I happened to also look at conference presentations that occurred last year in the Middle East, and looking ahead, that what they want to do is also in the future develop and test under various scenarios the maximum concentrations of radionuclides in air, water, and soil. So that is in their plan. So they are recognizing the limitation of awareness in regard to the actual effect on all species, all organisms, that we're still in early days in really understanding the potential radionuclide impacts. And the question, huge question is, for me, is really, can we rely on the modeling and the technological tools that are really in the mainstream of practice today? And I would say we're not there yet, and so I do appreciate that the ICRP acknowledges that much more needs to be done to improve the understanding of potential impacts. So they also point out that that the tools, well, they themselves say that the tools available today are still not developed enough to really address the complexity of an ecosystem approach to understanding potential consequences of radionuclide releases. And I just wanted to here focus on the different pathways that the ICRP identifies in terms of different types of exposures, which include inhalation of resuspended contaminated particles or gaseous radionuclides, contamination of fur, feathers, skin, and vegetation, ingestion of lower trophic level plants and animals, direct uptake from the water column, ingestion of contaminated water, external exposure. The configuration of the source relative to the target clearly depends on the organism's ecological characteristics and habitat. A benthic dwelling fish will, for example, be exposed to radiation from radionuclides present in the water column and deposited sediments, whereas a pelagic fish may only be exposed to the former. And I put that in just as one little detail, one example about the complexity of even different types of fish, of how they will respond to radionuclides in different ways. So this is data that is begun to be investigated and collected, and there's still so much more to do. And they also are trying to improve on their modeling, and I didn't have time to, I did bring if you want to ask me a question afterwards about voxel phantoms in terms of looking at doses in an improved way from even currently what is being used to do these measurements. So now I want to look at the Lake Fringe watershed, because now if you look at the picture on the left, if you look around the coast and the color green, you can see that just around Kincardine, and unfortunately the name tag covers over this one watershed area. And I just want to point out that how few watersheds are on this eastern side of the lake. And so this watershed is really important because it's broken up, and watersheds have, and the wetlands have disappeared along a lot of the coast. And so the protection of the lake fringe watershed, which we see on the right, and that extends, it extends south of Bruce Power and the proposed site for the proposed DGR all the way up to Southampton. So that whole area is an ecosystem, and it's a sub-watershed area, and of course it's totally interconnected with the larger watershed region, and other watersheds. So you can keep kind of expanding at different levels, like how ecosystems are interrelated to each other geographically. But I just wanted here to point out that there are certain concerns here you know, what I mentioned last year, and other people have mentioned, and Bev Fernandez yesterday, was the reminder about the concern about the potential impact on the Great Lakes Basin. But even if we just focused on watersheds, instead of looking at just one tiny little, you know, site where the proposed DGR itself is proposed to be constructed, I mean, to me, that is not good enough. That there is still potential harm that can be caused environmentally, like even in the region of this area along the coast for Bruce County and continuing. So wetlands are under stress and under threat, and there are various causes for that, including wetland draining or filling, contaminated runoff, artificial changes in water levels, and the spread of exotic and invasive species. Now, in the next slide, I want to emphasize that Baie du Doré in the municipality of Kincardine is part of the coastal wetland system, and it's related to the DGR project. It's all interconnected, and there are rare species in this area. There are species at risk, including turtles, and I haven't seen that mentioned specifically in the OPG documents. I remember reading once in a technical report last year that they only found one turtle. So I got the impression, the conclusion was that turtles aren't that important because we only saw one. But I mean, that's why it's important, because turtles are disappearing. They are species at risk, so we need to be concerned about all species, not just a few. And also, the Ministry of Natural Resources has declared this region like the Class 2 provincially significant wetland, of which the DGR is interconnected ecologically. And another point is that benthic invertebrates are good indicators of water quality, responding quickly to environmental stressors such as pollutants. However, a very key benthic invertebrate includes the crayfish, and the habitat for the crayfish is identified as being disrupted by the proposed DGR. Now, the OPG says it's only 1% disruption for the crayfish, but how do we know that? Based on what models? What kind of evidence? How can we really verify and say unequivocally that only 1% are being affected, especially when they are very important if they could be utilized to be indicators of possible future contaminants, and should they not be considered in creating the baseline now of how the water system is and so on prior to any potential future contaminants. The other thing about more disruption to this area, and then I also got the sense that in the OPG documents that because the area is already disrupted, it isn't of consequence to do more disruption. And I mean, that was just what went into my body, that just the that there wasn't really much concern. But more disruption also could cause more invasion by these invasive grasses, which are quite a major issue in Lake Huron, and they're being acknowledged by the environmental organizations. And so more disruption would cause these common reeds to perhaps invade this local area, and what they do is they release poisons into the roots of native plants. So there's all these ripple effects. 5 minutes, okay, moving right along. So again, last year, not in my presentation last year, but at the microphone one day, I mentioned this wonderful study done by the University of Michigan on Great Lakes stressors, and just look at that red dot right at this area here. And what that refers to is cumulative stress. And the people doing the study told me that they did not include radionuclides in the study, but they do include nuclear power plants, and the other cumulative stress factor is agricultural runoff. So I feel it's very important that when cumulative effects are being evaluated, that agricultural runoff needs to be included absolutely, and not just the nuclear power plant. So in terms of significance determination for residual adverse effects, well, here is the methodology for anyone to read later who is not already familiar with the aspects that were asked by the JRP for the OPG to please give evidence for and use the precautionary principle. And what really blew me away, which was why I did all this other research, because I could have done a totally different presentation looking at every page and analyzing every page of the OPG document. But what really was upsetting was to read both the EIS and the enclosed reasoned argument narratives reach the same conclusion, that the DGR project will not result in any significant adverse effects. And I just question that collective conclusion for everything that I just don't think is good enough, because we don't know enough yet. We don't have the tools to properly evaluate potential impacts on living organisms. So I'm just going to close off here that I say there is no justification provided by the methodology to give OPG a license to proceed on the construction of a deep geological repository. The science is not available, as the ICRP honestly declares in its continued pursuit to improve methods. Even if ecosystem principles were applied, still very early in their maturation, can we really afford the hubris as a human species to proceed with burial of any level of radioactive waste with so much still unknown about the planetary life support system? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greer.